Hello, everybody. Welcome to DIA. My name is Megan Holly Witko, and I'm co-curator of the Chryssa New York exhibition that we have on view here at DIA. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. This is our first public program associated with the exhibition, which just opened 2 weeks ago tonight. And it is something that I hope you've all had a chance to see in the galleries next door. And we are really thrilled here at DIA to be presenting the first museum survey of Chryssa's work since the Albright Knox show in 1982 in the United States. So something we've talked about a lot at DIA is that this exhibition was many years in the making. There's a lot of conversations over the past 7-8 years in order to bring this here. And something that myself, as well as my co-curator at the Menil, Michelle White, spent a lot of time doing was talking to as many people as possible who knew Chryssa during her lifetime, and also seeing as many pieces of her artwork as we could. And so I remember seeing the beautiful piece that the Guggenheim owns, which is in our galleries next door, called Newspaper Number 3, in the Guggenheim storage facility a few years ago, and just being blown away by it at the time, and discussing with the staff there. And I remember someone saying, "Oh, Blake Gopnik was just here to see this piece the other week," and thinking like, "Oh, okay, well, I got to talk to him." So since then, I was interested in talking to Blake and hearing more on his thoughts about Chryssa and, of course, about Warhol. And it was really, having read Blake's writing on that, we were really thrilled to see these early and pivotal connections that he was making between Warhol and between Chryssa. And since that time, Michelle and I have been eager to bring him here to speak and to hear more on his thoughts about these two mononym artists, one very well known and one, of course, not as well known to the public, but we're hoping this exhibition will bring her back into that conversation. So before I hand things over to Blake, I would just want to give you a bit more about his biography. In addition to the Warhol biography that I mentioned, he is also currently writing a biography of Albert Barnes, the great American collector of modern art, to be published by HarperCollins. He has been a staff art critic at the Washington Post and Newsweek, and is now a regular contributor to the New York Times. And he has a PhD in art history from the University of Oxford. So without any further ado, welcome to Blake Gopnik.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's just a complete joy to be here at DIA. It's a place I've always cherished more than anything. Been coming here for a very long time. And of course, it has a very old and long connection to, if not my hero, my obsession, Andy Warhol. So it's great to be here imagining that if only he could be here watching me say things that he probably would disagree with completely about his own work and Chryssa's work. I also want to thank your colleague Jordan. I've been bugging them with random questions about tiny details about Chryssa for the last few weeks, and they've been extremely patient at the hundreds of emails I've been sending at 3 a.m. And of course, Jessica Morgan, who I don't think is here tonight, the director here at DIA, was incredibly kind in inviting me in the first place to give this talk. And Emily Markert and Michelle White I have to thank as well, who was my first contact in the Chryssa world. As Megan said, she's the co-curator at the Menil. And she was the first person I ever talked about Chryssa with, I think. And Kim Golding as well, who's been arranging all the technical stuff and the administrative stuff and has been really helpful to me. So thanks to everyone. Let me tell you a little bit about how I came to care about Chryssa. And as I hope many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of millions of people will come to care about Chryssa, because she deserves to be cared about. And the really grotesque neglect that she's had now for decades and decades absolutely needs to be reversed. And the neglect was so great that when I saw this piece at the Whitney, when the Whitney reopened in 2015, there was a salon-hung wall of all sorts of things from the permanent collection. And this was on that wall, and it kind of blew me away. It was by this artist I'd never heard of, who somehow had lost either her first name or her last name, just one name, Chryssa, as the label said. And it was, the label said that this was a piece called Sock Ad, that already, at this point, I had been working on Warhol for 2 years. In fact, today is close to the 10th anniversary of the beginning of my obsession with Andy Warhol, so I'm glad to be talking about him today. At that point, my obsession was new. My interest was new. My research was just beginning. And I saw this thing that seemed to me to have all kinds of rhymes with Andy Warhol. And it was dated to the late 1950s, early 1960s. And I asked myself, well, wait a minute, how does this relate to Warhol's work? It seems awfully early. And it was listed as a 2-color silkscreen, which of course set my radar off like crazy. So I wanted to know a little bit more, of course, about this work. I got very excited. But first I want to show you just the details so you can see what actually is going on here. It's actually sock ads that have been appropriated from the newspaper and then turned into this grid of images on the surface. It's a work on paper. You can see the whole thing there and then the details. That gives you some idea of what's going on here. And of course, what I thought was, wow, this is not a million miles from Warhol's very, very early, among his very first silk screens. In fact, actually, his first silk screens, the dollar bill works. This is a 2-color version of a $2 bill, and it seems to have lots of rhymes with the Chryssa that I had just seen. Now, before I go any further, I want to make, as they say, one thing perfectly clear, that though this talk is going to be about Andy Warhol and Chryssa, that is not because Chryssa is the handmaiden to Andy Warhol or gave birth to Andy Warhol or any other kind of feminine metaphor you want for the relationship. She doesn't matter because of Andy Warhol. I want to make that very clear. Even though I'm a Warhol lover, I'm almost as much a Chryssa lover. In fact, getting to be more and more of a Chryssa lover. She doesn't matter because of him. She matters because of what she did. But I think that what happens, the reason I want to talk about them together, is because sometimes when there's someone who derives their work or is influenced by another artist, sometimes they zero in on features that the original innovator wasn't as conscious of. An innovator often is dealing with lots and lots of issues, and the people who follow from them sometimes can zero in and help us retrospectively focus on what's important about that original innovator, or at least some aspects of that original innovator. You could say that Chryssa had too much on her plate at her very early date, and Warhol then realized some of the things she was working with and helps us understand that. So that's my first caveat. There are going to be 2 major caveats tonight. So if anyone knows how to count to 2, that's the first one. You can see if I tell the truth. So there are these rhymes between Warhol and Chryssa, and I want to call them rhymes because it's very hard to establish the exact causality. Both of them lied like crazy about all sorts of dates, including their birth dates, so it's not always easy to tell exactly what's happening. But as I dug deeper into the Warhol-Chryssa connection, the connection became that much clearer. Into the Warhol-Chryssa rhymes, the connection became that much clearer. And here's one of the full Andy Warhol dollar bill, $200 bills, next to a detail half of the 1961 piece just called Newspaper by Chryssa that's in the next room. And if you haven't had a chance to see the works today, please do come back to DIA, because all of the works in this show are fabulous, and I particularly like the far room, the room furthest from here. Actually, this is Warhol's $192 bill, so if anyone was counting to 200, there's only 192 here. But the rhyme seems very strong to me between these 2 works. So the question is, what's the actual relationship between them? And as I dug deeper and deeper into the actual historical relationship, I realized that Warhol almost certainly knew those Chryssas that I see as rhyming with his works, because she had a solo show at the Guggenheim Museum from November to December of 1961. And this thing got tons and tons of press. There's no way. Warhol was the biggest culture vulture you could imagine. There is no way he did not go to see an important young artist's work at the Guggenheim Museum. I'm absolutely convinced that he would have seen it either there or at Betty Parsons' gallery, one of the most important galleries in all of New York. There's no way Chryssa's solo show that's happening at exactly the same time as the Guggenheim, that he wouldn't have seen that as well. As far as I'm concerned, it's a slam dunk that he would have known Chryssa's work and been kind of obsessed with it. Because already by the 1960 Whitney Annual, a critic called Chryssa one of the bright new people to watch. That's the kind of thing that was red meat to Warhol, any quote like that about another artist especially. Then her Guggenheim show gets a review, and the critic says, of one thing I'm certain, she's an original. Now, being an original is about the thing that Warhol wanted to be more than anything else. And the Betty Parsons show goes on to get a 3-page rave review in Art International magazine, which we know Warhol read because copies of it, tons of copies of it exist in his archive, and I've seen them and fingered them my very own self. And the Guggenheim catalog, if you can just see at the top left, refers to the work as being of particular significance and excellent. There's no way that Andy Warhol would not have been carefully attentive to work of particular significance and excellence. Chryssa gets a celebrity kind of profile in January '62. There's the headline, Greek artist finds Times Square poetic. This is a full-blown profile, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is all infinitely more than Andy Warhol would have got at that moment. So he certainly knew her work. I feel there's no doubt about that whatsoever. So I want to talk for the rest of this talk, not about those kind of art historical issues, and not immediately art historical issues, but about what Chryssa's innovations really were and what they meant for Andy Warhol, and because of that, what he lets us understand about those innovations, what he lets us focus on. I'm going to be talking first about indexicality, and then about ostension, and finally about gender. Those are the three important qualities or issues that Chryssa's work addresses that I think Warhol borrows, steals, is influenced by with her work. So first of all, I think that looking at Warhol lets us understand, underlines for us the indexicality in Chryssa. Of course, that's one of the great postmodern cliches, in fact, at this point. But all I'm talking about, as I'm sure all of you now know, is the notion of something that leaves a direct trace of its presence, that it's represented by its own trace. The obvious famous example is the footprint in the sand is an indexical mark of the person who walked in it. Has a direct relationship, so that it represents in a kind of very direct way. And the same can be said of Chryssa's works, all those newspaper works. We don't know exactly how they were made, but they're clearly what the story is that she found the old newspaper printing plates. She was hanging out in Times Square, which of course in those days was where various newspapers were, especially of course the New York Times, and got hold of the printing plates themselves. Whatever they were made of, it's not completely clear what was happening in newspaper printing at exactly that moment. This will be found out when I get to do some more digging. But the process of stamping has a kind of indexical quality to it. A direct impression of the world onto art, into art. And because of that, there's some kind of notion that style is bracketed. Style is elided in this process, and it's at least as though style is elided because the world makes a direct imprint. And of course, those are all things that are very important to Warhol pretty much throughout his whole career, and I'm showing here the H&S green stamps that he made, and those are also literally stamped by Warhol. Now, he hand-carved an art eraser as a stamp to make these images of green stamps, which were kind of the air miles of their day. So in a way, they're much less indexical than than Chryssa's works, because they're hand-carved, so they have an arty, handmade quality, and he then leaves that behind in favor of silk screening. And I think it's quite likely, quite possible, that in fact when Warhol saw these works, he might easily have thought that they were silk-screened, because lots of other people have thought they were silk-screened since then. Chryssa's works have often been described as silk screens. In fact, that sock ad, as I said, though it isn't a silk screen, it's a stamping as well. The Whitney, until quite recently, thought it might be a silk screen, a two-color silk screen. And then, of course, the photographic silk screen is kind of indexical, because photographs always have an indexical quality to them. So this is one important thing that I think Warhol gets from Chryssa, or at any rate, an important rhyme between them, or at any rate, something that Warhol lets us concentrate in among Chryssa's innovations and excellences. And of course, indexicality is very important in Warhol. In these paintings, his oxidation paintings, which of course I prefer to refer to by their original names, the piss paintings, right? Nothing is more indexical of pissing than a pile of piss on a surface. So that's what we get here. And in fact, in 1962, Warhol was already making pictures. These oxidations, so-called oxidation piss paintings, are made by coating the canvas in copper powder, essentially. His 1962 paintings, which unfortunately still survive, are actually piss-colored because he pissed directly on them. He also would sometimes put canvases in front of his door so anyone coming in had to step in them. So it's the classic example of indexicality, and he was doing that in probably 62 as well, probably after he already knew Chryssa's work. Now, we've talked about indexicality. I'm also interested in this notion of ostension, which is not my coinage, but it's a term I'm very interested in. I take it from the philosophy of language, where it's used to refer to the act of pointing at something and simply pointing at something as the only way in which you refer to it. And I think it's a very important and very neglected aspect, in fact, of art. That is, seeing art as being kind of directly transparent to the thing it represents, where the artistic act is simply one of pointing to something, regardless of style, regardless of visual qualities. There's just the act of pointing. And it's linked to the index, because the index, in a sense, is the most direct way to ostend towards something, because the thing itself is making the mark. So here we have Chryssa's car tires, which are in the show around the corner, and Warhol's Campbell soups. And it's worth noticing that in the case of Warhol, of course, once Warhol became famous, we have way more criticism about him than we do of Chryssa ever. As soon as he showed the Campbell soups, people started talking about them as though they weren't representations, as though they were just the things themselves. In the early days of Warhol criticism, there was really confusion on the part of critics about whether we're looking at the work itself or the object represented or a representation of that object. There's a real ostensional quality to Warhol's works, and I think to Chryssa's works as well. You'll note that I'm not discussing the pop cultural subject matter of either Warhol or Chryssa, or making any links between them, because I think actually by late 61, even mid 61, it was kind of a cliche already, that it was pretty obvious that one of the things artists would do is take things out of pop culture. So I'm not interested in those links between Warhol and Chryssa, because I think they're kind of obvious, and they would have been obvious at the time. It would have been an obvious move for an artist. Stuart Davis had been doing it already in the 20s, and of course Picasso had as well, and you get Jasper Johns in the 50s. Those links are much less interesting to me. It's the links, the indexicality, the ostension, that I think are really interesting in Chryssa. And then, most importantly of all, and the rest of my talk will be completely about this, it's what really interests me is Chryssa and the concept of the feminine, the issue of the feminine and femininity and female gender, that I think is really crucial in understanding the rhymes between Warhol and Chryssa, the links between Warhol and Chryssa. It's a really complicated part of Chryssa that I think that we need to unpack, and Warhol helps us unpack it. And I think it's very neglected in the little bit of criticism there has been about Chryssa. I think it's a really missed element in it. So here's Andy Warhol. We'll go straight to Warhol here for a minute. Warhol commenting on women and women's art. The reporter says, "You think of women as pretty much equal, don't you? I mean, you're not a male chauvinist pig, are you?" And Warhol says, "They're better." And then below that, I've got an actual image of an interview with Andy Warhol where the writer says, "The Indian weavings," which he calls ladies' art, I love that, ladies' art, "is," Warhol explained, "like American quilts, yet another proof that women are the world's major artists." That's a verbatim quote from Andy Warhol. So his sensitivity to issues of art and gender are very important. And I'll just have you remember the reference here to American quilts and Indian weavings, because they're going to become important in a minute to understanding the relationship between Chryssa and Warhol. So here we're looking again at this. Now we're looking at the $200 $1 bills, I think, and one sheet from the newspaper portfolio. And one of the important things that happens, I think one of the most important links between Warhol and Chryssa, is the formal notion, the formal quality of all-overism, right? A surface that's completely covered with a similar series of marks. So that formal relationship, I think, is the strongest relationship between them. And I think that that's actually a rhyme about gender and the feminine. For instance, Lucy Lepard in 1972 is interviewed for an article called Is There Women's Art? Or Is There a Women's Art? And she says, one of the qualities of women's art, this is Lucy Lepard speaking in 1972 after feminism is already well underway. She says, one of the qualities is a uniform density or overall texture, often sensuously tactile and repetitive to the point of obsession, right? This is the kind of overallism that I'm talking about. And then Chryssa herself, in a 1968 lecture, points to the quality in her own work where the density of the form is equal over the entire working area. So this is very important, as we'll see in a minute, to the whole notion of the feminine in the era when Chryssa is coming of age as an artist. Now this is my second caveat comes now. The second time I want to make something perfectly clear. And that is that I'm not talking about essentialist notions of gender. I don't think that every person born a woman or who becomes a woman automatically wants to start doing all-overist art. I'm not claiming that. I'm not claiming that there are any essential aesthetic qualities that inhere in men or women, and I'm not committed in any way to a binary that divides the world between men and women or female and male. But I am arguing that in 1961, people bought that essentialism and bought that binary, and that's a crucial context for understanding what's happening with Warhol and with Chryssa at this moment. I'm arguing that Warhol would have read all-overism and therefore Chryssa as being specifically gendered female, as being part of the feminine. And his borrowings from her, his interest in her, that I'm positing at least, helps us understand how she fits into the context of female all-overism and what that means. And I think her work, her early work at least, and even as we'll see her later work, has to be understood in that context. So just a quick run through the female all-overism of the late 1950s and early 1960s. I've been accumulating examples, and I've got a huge pile of examples. All the other slides I had to cull from my presentation at the last minute for length. But here's one good example, Yayoi Kusama, right? Accumulation of letters, it's called, but it's more than accumulation of letters. It's an accumulation of her name, right? Of her signatures, in a sense. It is her signature, and it's Kusama identifying herself. And I would say identifying herself with all-overism and therefore identifying herself as a woman, as an all-overist, if you like, woman. And here we have a wonderful textile by Ruth Asawa from Black Mountain College, something she made when, guess what? She was working in the laundry at Black Mountain College, because everyone who worked there, all the students at least, had to do menial labor, if you like. The men were doing nice outdoorsy stuff, and guess what? The women ended up doing the laundry. That is an old tale that still survives, as my wife will tell you, I guess. So she's doing this in the late 1940s. We don't know the exact date of this. And what she decides to do is turn one of the sheets into a work of art, into a work of textile art. She stamps BMC. If you look closely, you'll see that that's what this is. It's a repeated stamp from the laundry. They usually stamp their sheets once with the Black Mountain College logo, but she stamps it all over and turns this into a work. And I can't prove that Warhol knew this, but it's very likely he might have done, because he knew everyone from Black Mountain College, had deep personal roots to people at Black Mountain College, and especially to printmaking at Black Mountain College. And if you read my book, you'll find out more about this, on sale now for only $14.99. I wish. And the other reason he might have known it is because it actually got turned out as an actual mattress ticking by an industrial textile maker. And there she is. There's Ruth Asawa herself lying on a mattress covered in her own fabric. And Warhol was deeply engaged in the world of textiles at this moment. And you could say that she's immersed in all-overism, but you might also say she's drowning in it. And you'll see why I'm interested in that notion of drowning. And I want you to remember this recumbent pose that she's in, because it's going to come up again in a minute. So what I think happens is Warhol profits from a feminine all-overism in his own art. And here's an example, right? His flowers at Leo Castelli's that he uses to cover the walls of Leo Castelli Gallery in 1964, I think have direct links to the feminine all-overism that he's interested in, and I could give you another 20 examples of that. The dollar bills, I think, partake of it as well. Something I forgot to mention, by the way, about the dollar bills is that he chose that work to be in his first ever, was his first ever work in a 1960s show. It was in a group show with Yayoi Kusama, in fact. So if he had seen Chryssa and was influenced by her newspaper paintings, he chooses the work that's most like her newspaper paintings to have his first ever public exposure as a pop artist, as it were. But here we have him in Castelli. This is really the high point in his career at this point. It's the most important gallery, you could argue, in New York at this moment, the one he most wanted to be in. And what does he do? He gives an example of extremely feminine all-overism. They're pansies. They're not pansies, in fact, but that's, interestingly, how the press usually referred to these flower paintings by a gay artist. And they come at exactly the same time as this spread in Life magazine of Marimekko fabrics. And in fact, if you look at the time, just as he's showing fabrics, there's way more coverage of Marimekko and their new flower pattern textiles than there is of Andy Warhol. So I see him inhabiting this feminine all-overism and turning it into a kind of trope in his play with signifiers. So I think he gets to the feminine by way of a textile aesthetic that comes through women's all-overism. And that textile connection, still in 1973 here, I'm giving a quote from an article about textiles by a feminist, an ardent feminist. It's from the Feminist Art Journal, in fact. That connection is seen as very close. For women, the arts most highly valued by male society have been closed to them, that is, painting and sculpture. They have put their creativity instead into needlework arts, which exist in a fantastic variety wherever there are women, and which in fact are a universal female art form. It is our, meaning women's, cultural heritage. So this is still a very strong concept, even among feminists. It may seem horribly essentialist to us, and in fact it's not really even sociologically or historically accurate. There were, in the 60s and always before that, plenty of men deeply involved in textile production, but it becomes the dominant cultural view and cultural myth already by the 60s. I would say that Andy Warhol inhabits that and runs with it, partly under the influence, in fact, of Chryssa. This is a talk about Chryssa, even if there aren't always Chryssas on the screen. Thinking back on his first pop silk screens, Warhol once said, "I was just making fabrics." And he actually had been just making fabrics at exactly the same moment. In the image on the left, that is a silkscreen fabric by Andy Warhol, probably from 1963. And I could give you another 10 examples of his silkscreen fabrics. So the notion that Warhol didn't know what silkscreens were until someone pointed out to him is complete bosh. We know he learned about them in detail in college, and then he used them all the time in making his textiles. And then in 1971, when he's offered a retrospective at the Whitney Museum, he says, "Oh, can't we just show my cow wallpaper?" Of course, wallpaper is really a kind of textile. And anything having to do with interior decoration is automatically gendered feminine at this point. He says, "Can't we just show my cow textiles instead, my cow wallpaper instead?" And the curators say, "No way, we're going to show some work." But he does get away with having all the work layered on top of cow wallpaper for this show. But this is something important to me, that even as Warhol is, you could use the word elevating the feminine, using the feminine, illustrating the feminine, exploring the feminine, possibly because of his roots, I think importantly because of his roots with Chryssa and other women artists, and I gave it a whole lecture and written a whole essay about how important lots of women artists, not just Chryssa, were to Warhol, really formative for him, I think. But even as he's doing that, he's always retaining an ironic distance from it. There's always a connotation of the abject, because Warhol was interested in the abject. So Warhol's interest in women's culture, women's art, femininity is complicated and problematic, I'd even say. Here's a quote from him. "I've made a career out of being the right thing in the wrong space and the wrong thing in the right space. That's one thing I really do know about it." And I think his interest in women's art is as something that's wrong to put in the right space of the gallery. Warhol is appropriating the wrongness of being a female artist. He's appropriating the wrongness of women making art. And his work is only artistically right by being culturally wrong. And that's a problem, as it were. When he's praising female textile artists, for instance, in the quote that we saw before, that counts as a radical anti-establishment move in the 1960s and 70s. And of course, that's a big problem for women artists. They don't have that distance from their own femininity. Women can't go there and declare the wrongness of the very thing that they are and are identified with. The feminine in the 1950s and 60s has unavoidable pitfalls that come with it. For women artists, not for men. And that context is important for understanding the Chryssas as they were shown at the Guggenheim and at the Betty Parsons Gallery. There's an almost universal attack on the feminine throughout the 50s and 60s in art culture, in fine art culture. So for instance, here, Robert Morris, in the appropriately titled Size Matters essay, says that the great anxiety when he was younger was to fall into the decorative, the feminine, the beautiful, in short, the minor, and note the equivalence of those words for an artist working in the 1960s as he remembers that period. And again, in an earlier version of this lecture, I had quote after quote after quote to the same effect, and I'm just going to include one now, which is a fan of Helen Frankenthaler talking about her work and saying, Frankenthaler's painting is manifestly that of a woman. Without Pollock's painting, hers is unthinkable. What she took from him was masculine. What she made with it was distinctly feminine. The broad, bleeding-edge stain on raw linen. Now that writer, and people talking about this writer, were clearly worried about that female bleeding, right? That was a problem for him, one way or the other. But I'm going to leave that aside for now and talk about the raw linen, because I think the raw linen is very important here. Making textiles was the salient thing that women did. They made work that related to textiles, that had that all overism, and that was a problem, because as far back as 1713, Lord Shaftesbury himself said, so that whilst we look on paintings with the same eyes as we view commonly the rich stuffs and coloured silks worn by our ladies, we must of necessity be effeminate in our taste, and utterly set wrong as to all judgment and knowledge in the kind. Right? Utterly set wrong if we are feminine in our taste. That was the dominant mode for art criticism, for art theory, for men thinking about art, writing about art, looking at art. And I'll just point out that this is a page from Warhol's newspaper, not Warhol's newspaper portfolio, Chryssa's newspaper portfolio, which may or may not have been silkscreened. This is still in abeyance to this day. Yesterday, a very prominent curator told me that it was almost certainly silkscreened because it was in such a small edition. That was Clara Rojas Sebesta of the Whitney Conservation Department, was pretty sure it was silkscreened yesterday, partly because it turns out this thing is on textile. It's actually printed onto textile. If you look very carefully at the copies that are in this show, on the very edge, you see that it's raveling, that it's actually a textile. And no one to this day knows if these things are lithographs, as they're sometimes described, or silkscreen. That will, I'm sure, be worked out in the next little while. But there is a textile relationship here. So I want to talk a little bit about the dangers of that for the artists of Chryssa's generation, or the generation just before her. Craft textiles were terribly dangerous for male artists in the 1950s. And that's the background for Chryssa. And let me just quickly go through some of the comments at Life magazine's roundtable where they were discussing Jackson Pollock. Sir Leigh Ashton, director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, said, it would make a most enchanting printed silk. Theodore Green, professor of philosophy at Yale, said that a Pollock would be a pleasant design for a necktie. And Aldous Huxley himself said, it seems to me like a panel for a wallpaper. Let me make very clear, these are not compliments about Jackson Pollock. So, a defense has to be mounted against the decorative, the feminine, in the manly art of Jackson Pollock. And here's Greenberg making one of many defenses. He says, the even all-over polyphonic picture in which every square inch is rendered with equal emphasis, and there are no longer centers of interest, that is, Pollock paintings, that such pictures should escape collapsing into decoration. Mere wallpaper patterns is one of the miracles of art in our age. I like that, miracles, right? It never occurs to me that that's not what's happened, that in fact they are simply polyphonic and wallpaper patterns. The miracle is that they escape from it. And it's no wonder he declares it a miracle they escape from it, that they escape from femininity, because a painting like Lavender Mist is credibly a feminine painting, right? Certainly as it would have been read at that time. It's no wonder that Greenberg has to protest too much, because the thing could so easily be read, would have been read, as feminine at the time. And those quotes from the 1948 Roundtable may very well have been meant to be derogatory because they refer to Pollock as feminine. And I'll just mention that this, of course, is the great Lavender Mist by Pollock, which was named by Greenberg. And I was trying to find out the date, when the first reference to it as that is. So I put the words Lavender Mist into a newspaper database, and what you get is 1 million accounts of this meadow rue flower. So in fact, Lavender Mist is named after a popular pale purple flower of the 1950s, is in fact what that is. But of course, Abex men can't afford to recognize that. They can't afford to recognize that they are appropriating, interestingly, my first usage of that word, my favorite word in the English language, but it's the first time I've used it tonight. They're appropriating a feminine gendered low form, and there are heavy scare quotes around low, the textile, into male gendered high art, but they can't afford to recognize that. And here's just one example of a textile from 1944, a pre-Pollock textile that must have been the kind of things that those Pollock haters had in mind. And I'd love to compile a whole list of Abexy textiles. This was done on silk, printed on silk in 1946, but the design is from a few years before that, from the John Heathcote Company in London. So there was rampant male chauvinism that was protecting itself from its repressed femininity. And that creates a dead end for the female identity that we see in Chryssa. She's forced into an untenable, every female artist is more or less forced into an untenable, undesirable, ladylike position by the dominant male culture at the time. And here we have an example of it. They're stuck in what I call the reclining woman trope, right? Here, Life magazine does a story called Women Artists in Ascendance, but it looks to me as though they're way more recumbent than ascendant. And we saw that even in the Ruth Asawa photograph that we saw earlier. Here's Frankenthaler, Helen Frankenthaler and Jane Wilson in 1957, being forced into a position of femininity. And here's the same image again. I couldn't resist this. I think Warhol is really playing on that notion when he has himself photographed this way in 1971. I think he's certainly would have been aware of this image, and if he's not riffing on this image, he's riffing on the femininity in an image like this, right? Women are allowed to make paintings, but as far as Life magazines are concerned, these are textiles to recline on. These are essentially rugs that they make, versus, of course, Mr. Jackson Pollock himself doing what real men do, dripping a mess off the end of their little stick, right? That's what real men do. That's, he gets to be erect above his surface. And you even see his painting erect on the wall behind him. It's not going to be a textile for long. It's going to be up on the wall. Now, I think this is very important for understanding what Chryssa is doing when she has her Guggenheim show. I think she's actually doing something extremely brave, and that is taking on that feminine aesthetic, being aware, at least intuitively, that it is a feminine aesthetic, that it's a textile aesthetic, that all over is essentially textilian and feminine for the moment that she's working in. And she's inserting it into the male space of Times Square, the male space of the newspaper. And it's interesting, this is from the review that praised her at the Guggenheim. It was mostly a positive review, but it's a very strange review. That text at the bottom says, Chryssa has something. I'm not sure yet whether it's anything more than an exceptionally sensitive and fastidious sense of design, right? Those are female traits, or whether her talent is essentially any more than that of a really first-class advertising layout man, right? So there's a male thing here, but it's an advertising layout man, which may be a questionable kind of man, a Warhol-like kind of man. But it's interesting. This is an author writing about newspaper paintings in a newspaper, citing first-class advertising layout men. It feels to me as though she is understanding the newspaper, at least again intuitively, as the place that Chryssa's paintings are sitting in conceptually, that's their home, in a sense, is in the world of newspapers. And I think that's important. And by the way, this is a female critic. This is Emily Genauer talking in this. So there's a whole set of gender expectations that I think are happening in that paragraph. That's the New York Herald Tribune of November 26, 1961. So soon after the Guggenheim show was opened. Chryssa gets a review already. Now, actually, I forgot to say something about this. You know, I was in the room over there writing, trying to describe in my notes, because I take a lot of notes. I'm old-fashioned that way in my little portfolio, my little notebook. And I was trying to describe this, and I wrote in my book, kind of linen suit look. And I suddenly realized, wait, that's incredibly male, right? The notion of the wrinkled linen suit, the summer suit, is incredibly male. And then I found myself talking about this one, and again, quite unconsciously, as being gray flannel. And it seemed to me that this was part and parcel of Chryssa inserting her feminine textiles, her female all-overism, into the male space of the newspaper. And this, of course, is her car tires, a series of images taken from tire ads. She didn't have to do that. She could have found much more female-gendered ads, but she chooses this one. Again, I think she's interested in that notion of gender stereotypes. And she talks about the importance of Times Square for her work. In that very first profile, the headline again, Greek artist finds Times Square poetic. And for the rest of at least the 70s, 60s, she talks about it. And of course, we've got the great gates of Times Square, her masterpiece, and my scare quotes, let me make them as big as I can. Her masterpiece is the gates of Times Square. Now think about what kind of space Times Square was at this moment. The New York Times on Times Square was as masculine a space as you could get. And there's a photograph of the inside of the newsroom of the New York Times at just about this moment. Imagine a Chryssa newspaper work on the wall of the New York Times, and I think you understand the kind of tension between the male and the female I'm talking about. She's transgressing gender codes, I think, but she's also negotiating them and making them the subject of her work. On the right there, that's, the Times Square newspaper stand is a completely male space. There's not a single woman present in that photograph. There is one place that women are notably present in Times Square, as Chryssa would have noticed, and that is in the peep shows and strip joints of Times Square, as we see here in a wild and wicked show in Times Square. And in fact, I went to the trouble of counting the figures in this photograph. There are 4 women and 12 men in this photograph. Times Square was a very gendered, male-gendered space. And Chryssa talks about the vulgarity of America as seen in Times Square. This is very important to her, that notion of vulgarity. And I think it's a male vulgarity. And her newspaper works, in fact, are anti-vulgar, I think, and anti-male in a sense, or at any rate playing with those concepts. And I'll just leave you with this image, because I think what we see here happening, what we have here is an early Chryssa, probably from 61 or 62, the blue image that says classified on it, that is again a stamped newspaper work, and neon has been attached to it later in the 1960s. And I think there's a sense that, for Chryssa, there was in fact no way to beat the men at Times Square. You had no choice but to join them, in fact, if you were going to succeed in that particular male chauvinist word, that patriarchal world. And I think what happens in the 60s is that she starts relinquishing gender markers, or at least gender stereotypes, when she starts working on the heavy metal of neon work, right? When she makes the gates out of working with metal fabricators and neon fabricators. There's a whole set of Guy Tech implications to that, which I don't think relates the same things, or maybe it does, but I think working that through and parsing that would be, in fact, the subject for an entirely other talk. So thank you very much, and I'd love to take questions from you.
Thank you for a really interesting discussion. And I'm curious, did Chryssa write about and is there much known, or are there writings that she did about her work? And did she discuss any of these notions? If so, yeah.
Megan would actually know more about this than I do. She didn't write a whole lot, and having been a Warhol expert or Warhol fanboy for 10 years now, I don't believe in the intentionality of artists just because it's so easy for them to lie, to obfuscate, to get it wrong. I'm not sure that even if Chryssa had believed she was working with these issues, she would have had the theoretical framework, at least in the early 60s, to talk about it, and she might very well have believed it and chosen to say the exact opposite of what she felt. So in general, I don't go to artists' words very much, unless, of course, it's my wife, to understand what their work is all about. I mean, I shouldn't say that. Actually, I do. I cheat. When I agree with them, I quote them like crazy, which is what all art historians do, right? When you think they're right about the work, you quote them. But as soon as you think they're wrong about the work, there's a deadly cone of silence that descends on their words in that particular area. But no, I think, Megan, I'm right in saying she wrote very little, certainly in the early 60s, right? And there are only a handful of interviews that I could find with her as well. There's some half-decent criticism, actually, some pretty interesting early criticism of her, and not every artist in the 60s was lucky enough to get smart things said about them. Warhol and Chryssa were two of the artists who actually did produce smart criticism, and that's not, I think, a bad sign of quality of art.
Also, maybe just a little plug that one of the few things we do have that's kind of a more comprehensive in Cryssa's voice is a lecture she gave in '68 that's in the catalog if you want to have a peek at it after our program here.
Yeah, when I was quoting her, I was quoting from that speech, that lecture she gave, actually.
At NYU, I believe.
It's a little disconnected. It's sort of exactly what you'd expect from Chryssa. She was a pretty tumultuous person and I think thinker, so she's not someone who wrote a lot and thought in those kind of discursive, propositional terms, I think.
Thank you, Blake. Fascinating to see the back and forth between these two phenomenal artists. I'm curious if you can say a little bit from your thoughts, actually, on, in a sense, Cryssa's interest in language is also very influenced by her background, coming from Greece and Cycladic art, and almost a kind of looking at her newspapers, in a sense, have the look of a kind of vestige of something, of a past, whereas Warhol is more invested in future, or present, I should say, in the nowness. So that really struck me in what you were presenting. We could talk later about the gendered side of it all. That's like an endless conversation, but really fascinating, as you put it forward. So I just wonder if you could talk or give your thoughts on those two different time periods or contexts for those artists.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to say that Chryssa and Warhol are in any way the same artist. They're obviously hugely different. I know you're not accusing me of having said that, Donna. I think it's obviously true that there's a difference there. I think period readings, though, might have seen them as more alike than we think. It's amazing the blindness of onlookers at this early kind of indexical, ostensional, appropriational art, that they seem to see it as much more straightforwardly transparent to the subject than we do. So I think in '61, Chryssa's work, especially by virtue of having been stamped and having been so visibly stamped, I mean, if you look at these closely, they're so obviously not handmade, they're hand stamped, but not, they don't derive from her mark. I think they would have registered as more like Warhol's than they do now. I think they would have registered as more like Campbell Soups than we think. And of course, the Campbell Soups are deeply retrospective as well. I mean, one of the things that people have commented on is how Warhol, in fact, often isn't talking about his own era, really. Because he's so interested in camp, he's often actually citing much earlier sources. So the Campbell Soup label is in 1895, I think, as a label. So he's often interested in the archaic as well, in nostalgia, exactly. So I think that those things, there's a complicated play in both. I mean, Chryssa's works, even though I think you're right, they are in some sense connected to an older European tradition, visually as much as anything. They also, by virtue of being newspapers, that's a radical move, right? Mimi Rotella, right? There's a whole history of engagement with the paper products of contemporary life. People have compared her work, especially to Jasper Johns, his numbers, his letters, But I think that's actually a pseudomorphism, a mistake, because those are so obviously handmade. There's no indexicality, or very little indexicality in them. They are, in a sense, even more old-fashioned, I think, than Chryssa, because they're still very much handmade objects and has the look of handmade objects. I think she's clearly influenced by Jasper Johns, but you could argue that she's a kind of hinge between Jasper Johns and Warhol, and she's, in fact, maybe what lets Warhol become more Warholian and less Johnsian. Because I think that the early, to get in the weeds a little bit here, it's a famous series of paintings where Warhol does one version of a Coca-Cola bottle that has marks all over it, sort of scratchy cancellations and hash marks all over it, and another that's perfectly clean. And people always say, oh, those are Abex marks that he's still doing. And I don't think that's true. I think those are John's marks. I think those are Rauschenberg marks. So I think what's happening there is he's still enthralled to them. And then, I'll hypothesize, having seen Chryssa, he then gets to a much clearer place. I'm not convinced of the Chryssa connection, but at any rate, that is the dynamic that's happening there, to answer your question in a terribly long-winded way. Excuse me.
That was really interesting, Blake. Maybe this question pulls away a little bit from the things that Chryssa and Warhol have in common, but I'm thinking about how interesting it is after that, how material and sculptural Chryssa's work becomes, and seems to kind of like move away from this period that you're largely focused on. And, the work becomes, more material. There seem like there are connections to the Zero artists, the Dutch sort of very material, monochromatic object. Although there is, the interesting, the aspect of the materiality of language, or language as material. But I just wondered if you have a sort of just a quick sort of way of just talking about what happens with her work sort of as it moves along.
Yeah, I hinted at it at the end of my lecture. No art historian or critic will ever give up on a conceit that they've come up with. So my way of dealing with that work is to say that there is a problem for women in the early 60s. It changes, of course, with pattern and decoration. It changes in the 70s, where women can inhabit these stereotypes about femininity, these notions of femininity and all-overism. That becomes important in feminist art, of course, in the 70s. I think in 1961 and 62, that was tricky. And I do think there's a sense that the way to break into the patriarchal world of New York art is to, in fact, do work that embraces issues of heft and weight and technology and materiality of that kind, right? This is, there's a certain similarity between very early Donald Judd sculptures and these Chryssas, and it could be, the influence could go in either direction, or maybe they're just working simultaneously in the same direction. But I do think that's one possible explanation for it at any rate. It is interesting, there's almost two different artists in the Chryssa show, and that's interesting. She really does. She continues doing some of the work with newspapers, especially when it comes to edition works, I think. So there are ones that are dated later, but it seems as though maybe that's because there's a market for them. I'm not sure about that. I'd have to ask Arne Glimscher about the market issues. But I don't have the answer. The truth is I don't have a good answer for you at all, but there is this impressive break. And I do love that early work. I think it's stunningly good. And the neon work as well, but it is interesting that there's that big a break. The one slide I had to remove that I think is interesting is the cycladic books at the far end of the far room, which are the earliest pieces in this show, and they're called cycladic books, but what they are is direct castings from cardboard boxes that she discovered, I think by accident. Is that right, Megan? And she realized, there's something interesting going on here. And that indexicality, I think, that's her first example of direct indexicality. And those were in the Guggenheim show too. And the combination of the cardboard box and indexicality, I think might have been something that entered Warhol's mind. But I think they're very important because they're actually fabulous works if you think about them for a minute. And I'm sorry she called them the cycladic books, because that introduces a kind of retrospective element to them. But I think if they hadn't been called that, they seem incredibly of a piece with the minimalism that's about to happen, with conceptualism. They could easily belong in a show of 1969 conceptualism, it seems to me. They're really powerful, important works that I think have been slighted. Well, everything Chryssa did ever has been slighted. Let's hope that changes, thanks to Dia. So there's my lousy answer, Steele, to your question. It's the best I could do.
Was she able to make a living from her work during her lifetime?
Megan would know better than me. Not a good one, I think. She was poor. Sometimes she was really poor. I mean, there was a moment, there's no way to sugarcoat this, she was an extremely difficult person to work with. So she changed dealers constantly. She was with Betty Parsons, and then who she was second before Glimcher, she's with Cordier and Ekstrom. There's only a story that she broke Cordier's arm. She worked with Pace and Arnie Glimcher, and that became problematic. I spoke to Hanford Yang, who talked about her and said she could be difficult. I don't care at all that she was difficult, and that's irrelevant, but it did affect her ability to make money at a certain point, I think.
She worked with Castelli towards the end in the 90s as well.
Yeah, that's right. So she worked with great dealers. Some of the greatest dealers in New York were willing to, frankly, to put up with her. I mean, the correspondence between her and Betty Parsons is almost comic, right, at times. They were willing to put up with her, but despite her being extremely difficult, because the art was so good. And it sold decently, at least at first. My impression is it sold adequately. The Betty Parsons records show a bunch of stuff selling for much, much, much more than Warhol sold for at the same time, like orders of magnitude more in 1962 than Andy Warhol was selling for.
Yeah, I mean, the Pace show in 66, which a lot of the neon works in that first gallery came from, sold out. It was incredibly, incredibly successful. And I think then there's a lot of work to try to get back to that point, and for a long time that's really hard to achieve again. Yeah.
Fascinating talk, and brought up a couple of questions for me. I'm just thinking about the relationship of the neon work to Warhol's involvement with celebrity. But what I really wanted to ask was whether your research has come up with anything, and this goes to your discussion of all-overness, whether your research has come up with anything more about the relationship she had with Agnes Martin, their mutual influence, and what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I'll cite again the earlier version of this lecture before I realized I would run out of time, where I had a bunch of Agnes Martins and images of Agnes Martin's work next to Chryssa's work. There's a story that Warhol, and I haven't been able to confirm where the hell this comes from, Rosalind Krauss says it at a certain point, that Warhol hung out at Cointy's Slip. And I mean, he knew everyone and cared about everyone. And of course, he knew Jasper and Bob Rauschenberg very well. He knew other artists from those circles. So he would have been aware of them. And of course, I think as a gay man, he would have been extra aware of them as a gay couple. And they were known, to the extent that anyone could be known as a gay couple at the time. They were known to be a gay couple in that world, in the very small world of gay artists at the time. So I think he would have absolutely been interested. He's on the record saying how much he likes Agnes Martin's work. There's only in my 40,000 item database of Andy Warhol, there's only one reference by him to Chryssa directly. But that doesn't mean anything. I think if I made a list of the top 50 artists of the 1960s, not every one of them would have been referenced by Andy Warhol, especially if he borrowed from them. He wasn't always great at giving credit, as everyone in this room knows. So that might have made him more resistant to actually mentioning her. But yes, I think the Agnes Martin thing is very important, and her all-overism is very, very important. I don't think she would have been comfortable talking about it in terms of feminism. I'm not an Agnes Martin specialist by any means, but from what I gather. But I think that but it's very important, I think, for understanding the cultural valence of those works. And I think the formal ties between Martin and Chryssa are obvious and clear and important.
All right, I think I'll end it there. Thank you all so much for coming. The show is open until through July, and then it's going to the Menil Collection in Houston and also Wrightwood 659 in Chicago. So thank you all.
Thank you.